Welcome to the University of Hartford Writers Podcast, the UHW podcast. I'm your host, Jason Dubour, and I'm joined by my fellow student and close friend, Michael Johnson Henry.
How you doing?
Just give us a quick, what year are you, what's your major, what are you studying here? Just give us a quick intro.
Well, I'm a computer science major. I'm a junior. I just really have an interest in, the arts and just technology as a whole.
All right. Okay. Let's get started. Today we are talking about the fantasy genre and its role in young adult literature, classrooms, school curriculums, things like that. To assist us, we have a bookshelf or a collection of books specifically in the fantasy genre. These books are among the most famous fantasy books in the series, and I'm sure you'll recognize some of them. We have the Lord of the Rings series, specifically the first book, The Fellowship of the Ring, and its prequel, The Hobbit. We have the first book in the long series, A Song of Ice and Fire, A Game of Thrones. And then we have the first book in the Inheritance Cycle, Eragon. Have you heard of any of these books, Mike?
Yeah, I've actually heard of all of these books. The only one I've actually, took part in reading is actually Lord of the Rings. I was a big fan of that growing up. I've heard a lot of good things about Game of Thrones, it's like not only the books but the TV series as well. I've heard a lot of great things about it, but I haven't actually watched it myself. And then Eragon, I also heard about it, and I believe there's been a film adaptation of that film. And I thought that was a pretty interesting title.
Okay, well, to give you an idea of what they're about and to give our viewers an idea of what the books are about, I just have some quick summaries that I'm just going to read aloud for you guys. The first book we have over here is Eragon, written by Christopher Paolini. It is the first book in his 4-book series, The Inheritance Cycle, and this is the summary. The land of Allegasia was once protected by a legendary legion called the Dragon Riders. One day, one of their own, a rider named Galbatorix, destroyed them all and named himself king of the land. Years later, one of the last remaining dragon eggs are stolen from him. It is sent to a farm boy named Eragon by magic. The dragon hatches and bonds with him. As a result, he is thrust into a world of magic and a war for freedom. He is sent to the Varden, a group of rebels attempting to overthrow Galbatorix's rule. Along the way, he and his dragon Saphira struggle to grasp their new position of power, the expectations for them, and what they will choose to do as dragon and rider. Next book that I'm going to do a summary for is specifically The Fellowship of the Ring. I only have The Hobbit here because it's considered a prequel, but technically The Fellowship of the Ring is the book that starts the trilogy, which is what it's known for. Again, you said that you know a little bit about this, and have you seen the movies?
Yeah, I actually owned a couple of them.
Okay, yeah. So this a lot of this will probably sound familiar to you. In the land of Middle-earth, eons have passed since the Dark Lord Sauron attempted to take control of the land and its races through his Ring of Power. The story, Fellowship of the Ring, begins with the wizard Gandalf visiting the Shire, land of the Hobbits, in search of his old friend Bilbo Baggins. It is Bilbo's birthday. Amidst the festivities, Gandalf discovers that Bilbo is in possession of that ring that they were talking about, which Bilbo found during an adventure they had years ago, and this is what The Hobbit is. It's the prequel. It's how Bilbo finds the ring. Bilbo has decided to leave the Shire and reluctantly leaves the ring to his nephew Frodo. Frodo is thrust into danger and risk as Sauron is attempting to find the ring and return it to him. In the past, Sauron had used the ring to try and control everybody, but the races of the land had sort of banded together and defeated him. And they thought that he was destroyed, but because his ring survived, he survived. So now that he's back, years and years later, he's trying to regain his ring. Frodo and his friends travel to the Elves, and together with many other characters, there are too many to get into right now, they form a fellowship with one goal: to take the ring back to where it was created, or called Mount Doom, and to cast the ring into the volcano and to destroy it. Along the way, Sauron sends his forces to try and retrieve the ring. Forced to take dangerous paths, the fellowship is eventually split up. Some of the characters die. They're split off into sort of 2 different groups. Frodo takes the ring and journeys with his friend Sam, and they go off to try and get rid of the ring, while the others attempt to hold back Sauron's forces to buy Frodo time. This will lead into the second and third books in the trilogy, which will eventually lead to the destruction of the ring. A Game of Thrones. Now, I learned this myself a couple of days ago. The TV series is called Game of Thrones, but the entire 7-book series that the author George R.R. Martin is working on, it's called A Song of Ice and Fire. So while this is called A Game of Thrones, it's just the first book, right. Whereas the show is going to be all 7 books. So, all right, A Game of Thrones takes place over the course of 1 year on the fictional continent of Westeros. The story is told through the perspective of 8 different characters, and each character's journey I think of all of the books we have here, this one is the most adult of all of them. It's filled with deception, mystery, adventure, betrayal, murder, sex, lots of adult stuff. Basically, there are 7 kingdoms in Westeros, and of the 7 kingdoms, one of them is chosen to rule over all of them. The throne that the ruling kingdom resides over is called the Iron Throne, and many different noble houses seek to take the throne now that the king that originally owned it has died. The legends of the throne speak of it having been forged in the breath of a dragon, and whoever sits upon the throne controls all of Westeros. In the background are whispers that one of the families, the Targaryens, they were originally the royal family of the continent, but they were overthrown and somebody else was put on. Known for their control of dragons and their alleged ancestry from dragons, the Targaryens were overthrown and replaced with another king. Now, leaders from each of the kingdom's houses are all caught in a power struggle to gain dominance over the Iron Throne and all of Westeros. So those are the 3 books we have here. Eragon is probably the easiest to go through, but it's also one of the most interesting ones. And then the next in the list, I think, would be Lord of the Rings, because the themes and stuff get a little deeper and darker, but it's not all the way to adult, whereas Game of Thrones is full-on all adult.
Right.
So I have a list of questions here that basically I'll read them to you and then we can talk about them. And so the first question I have is, would any of you guys, or would you read any of these books if you have not already, and why would you read them?
I think if I was to, pick up any one of these books and start reading it, honestly, it would probably be the first book of the Lord of the Rings series, because I find that to be a really interesting series with the characters having really deep, story. Like, they really have their own personalities and they all sort of express them in different parts of the film. And I feel like whenever you read the book or the novel that a film has been adapted into, there's always more of that. You can always find more examples of that in the book. Game of Thrones was written by, not written by 8 different people, but from the perspective of 8 different people, rather. I think that would be something interesting, because I've read a book that talks from the perspective of different people before, and I think that also gives a very interesting, storyline and a way for the information to be processed by the reader. So I think that might be a really interesting read as well.
Right. Some of the similarities between these books are, later in the Lord of the Rings series, the story is actually told through different perspectives. There's the group of Frodo and Sam as they go off and do their thing. And then there's the other group, which is Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, Gandalf, and they do their thing. So there's 2 perspectives right there. We talked about Game of Thrones has 8 different perspectives. It has 8 characters because each character belongs to one of the houses, I'm guessing. And then actually, Eragon, or the Inheritance Cycle, does the same thing in the later books as well. Eragon, the main character Eragon, has a cousin named Roran, and basically, I think it starts in the 2nd book. We have Eragon and his journey in learning magic, how to be a dragon rider, all that stuff. And then there's his cousin who, just because he's related to Eragon, has to go through his own stuff. And then eventually they kind of come back together at the end. What bearing do you think these particular books have in the world of young adult literature, or in the world of the fantasy genre in general?
Me personally, I feel like a lot of these books hold a lot of weight when it comes to making a lasting impact on the literature that's to come, because I feel like the art that comes prior to what's going to be the next best thing always has to take from what's already come prior to it. And I feel like even if you don't actually read each one of these books individually, you feel some of the trickle-down effects that are passed down through literature in the future, because a lot of these different techniques will be employed for years to come.
Right. It's kind of like the thing where they say cliches have been used so many times that it's hard to come up with something original. I had a professor here who I put in a piece of fantasy, and she completely rejected it. She was like, it's been used so many times, you need to come up with something original. So the fantasy genre, I think, is definitely one of the most difficult ones, because it's hard to come up with something that's brand new and fresh. But at the same time, the fantasy genre, I think, has the most interesting things in it because it's a fantasy world. It's unrealistic. It's impossible things that can happen that don't happen in the real world. And I think that draws readers in and gives them a kind of freedom. The third question we have is, why do you think books like these are not a part of things like summer reading lists in schools, or why they're not included in the classroom environment more often than they are? Now, before you answer, I will say that a long time ago, The Hobbit was actually one of the books that students had to read in the classroom, but I don't think it's as prominent today as it was back then. Right. So why do you think books like these aren't included more in summer reading lists in the classroom?
In my experience, I remember being younger and we were supposed to read a book like Harry Potter, let's say, which is another popular fantasy title. I remember that there was a child in my class who wasn't allowed to read the book. She wasn't permitted by her parents to read the book because they didn't believe in teaching their children about witchcraft and these sorts of things. Now, mind you, we look at the times and we know people have problems with like the national anthem. I think that just trying to be tolerable of everybody's beliefs, it also comes into play because, you know, if you don't want your children learning about that, then the public school system shouldn't really force it upon them. So if the schools realize that became a continuing thing, like more households felt that way, then maybe that might have some impact in what they teach in the curriculum.
I agree with you a little bit, but I would also say that whenever a classroom tries to include texts, if it's an English class, they have certain texts that they read to teach the students a certain craft or something, it's difficult for the students to read those books if they're not engaged or interested in them. And I think fantasy genre books are a little bit more engaging than some other books, not because like there are a lot of realistic books that talk about things like rape and racism and sexism and stuff like that, deep social topics.
Right.
But I think that because those books have those topics, for some reason they have more weight on them than these do, which I think is a little, not absurd, but a little unfounded, because these books, despite being fantasy, they can have those dark themes or those difficult themes. One example is in Eragon, later in the series, he struggles with the idea of having to kill King Galbatorix. He doesn't want to take a life,
right,
but at the same time, people are kind of pressuring him to do it. And that's maybe it's not something that people today would experience, but it's still a difficult thing for a character to go through and deal with, and by watching how that character goes through that, we can kind of mirror that with ourselves and be like, okay, well, how can I deal with my own situation?
But yeah, I really agree with that point, because I feel like even if you're giving someone a theoretical situation or one that's slightly based on reality and then is askew in some realm of fantasy, it can still be tied to some emotional experience or some, real life lesson. There could still be conveying of a lesson, even if it's in a parabolic sort of measure. You can still teach somebody something through the media of fantasy.
I feel like when it comes to nonfiction books or realistic books, the themes and stuff are so simple and explicit and direct, like you know immediately what it is based on what happens.
Right.
But these kinds of books, you kind of have to take the fantasy aspect of what happens and create like a metaphor for it, like Lord of the Rings. The whole point of the book is to get rid of the Ring of Power. Right. And it's ironic that it's a ring. So this book really focuses on greed, because the ring corrupts the characters, changes the characters, and they're so desperately trying to get rid of that.
Right.
And we talked about how Eragon, he has to deal with taking a life. So that this series, I think, talks about the sanctity of life and death and what people deserve to live, what people don't. Game of Thrones is a whole other ballgame because it's so adult. If you guys have watched the show, or if you guys have read any of the books, you'll understand what I'm talking about. They use very coarse language. They use very direct, real and fantasy images like harems and men who bring large groups of women to their chambers and things like that. It's very, very adult. So to have fantasy books like this where you read it and you have to take the fantasy equivalent and find a metaphor for it, I think that's useful in the classroom. That's a very, very important tool for young readers and writers to have, especially in the world of young adult literature. If you're going into a field where you're going to be using books or writing, if you want to become a better writer, you have to read.
That's absolutely true.
So, when compared to the books that do show up in school environments, what do you think these books have that those books don't, that would make these books better or more exciting choices for students?
Well, I remember in my experience reading when I was younger, I found that fiction was always a lot more fun and a lot more, just really the way that they express ideas and the way that they evoke imagery, it just brings you to a whole new place. And I find that that in itself works wonders for creativity of youth, you know, because when you can think unboundingly and think about, you know, concept ideas or things that, you know, are outside the realm of normal everyday life, then that's how you sort of break boundaries and are able to do things that are out of the norm and unconventional, but can also do great things. And I find that the more that you're exposed to those sort of groundbreaking ideas and just new thoughts and new ways of thinking and new vocabulary and diction, all those things really can increase your complexity of thought altogether. Some amount of fantasy in our, you know, American education system, but I do think that they could work in more and it could have a positive effect on the learning of the youth.
Well, you kind of segued into our last question, which was, what can the fantasy genre teach us as readers and writers that other types of books like realistic fiction or nonfiction can? And I think you're right. It definitely improves a person's creative views. It lets them play around with themes and tropes and symbols and things like that. But because there's that creative aspect, they have complete freedom with how they want to read it or how they want to write it. I know from personal experience, writing your own book or creating your own world is extremely hard.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially if you were to put all of these authors together in the same room and talking about their worlds, I'm sure each of them had their own process on how they created it.
Right.
And actually, we'll see if I can pick it up, but every single one of these books, and I think most fantasy books do this, they'll have a map on the inside to help readers keep track of where characters are, or just to really bring them in. So this is the map for Eragon, and I'll open up the other ones. Although I think because the books are so small, we won't be able to see them. But
it's all there in detail.
It's all there, and I think one of the things that really makes the fantasy genre intriguing and interesting is you create that world, or the author creates that world, and maybe it's a world that's relatively small, or maybe it's a world that's really, really big. But presenting that world to readers immediately gets them interested. It's like, what sorts of things are the readers going to find in all the different places they see in the world or on the map?
Right.
I definitely think, to wrap up this whole podcast, that the fantasy genre deserves more credit than it's given. And I think that it should definitely be included more in classrooms and curriculums. Professors will have students, or they'll like create a list of texts that they're gonna have the students read to maybe make a certain point or talk about. But if the students are able to pick their own books, then they engage more with those texts. And I think with what fantasy can do and how engaging and creative it is and how impossible it is, there's a lot more potential for these than some of the other books.
Right.
Other than these three, do you have any particular fantasy series that you yourself have read that you want to recommend to the people watching?
Well, of course, I have to give a shout out to the ultimate, you know, Harry Potter. I mean, gosh, I could talk about Harry Potter for hours, but I won't do that to you guys because I know there's other people's podcasts you have to watch. But I will say that I have enjoyed that for many a year. And also, you know, just another book plug. Jason and I also read a book as part of a class that we took prior. It's called Don Quixote, which is another fantasy book about an old rich man who had basically gone senile and began to believe from reading so many fantasy books that he was actually a knight and he should go about Spain and try to save and rescue damsels in distress. And I think that story had so many underlying themes that you could miss if you are not an active reader. And I think that in itself is like a challenging book, but also a book that has a lot of lessons in it that people can take away from it. And, you know, I think it's a great example of fantasy literature, and it probably has impacted a lot of the books that we're looking at right now.
Yeah, I think Don Quixote was definitely I want to call it a historical fantasy book, in that it was completely made up, but it because it was situated in the real world, it had some sort of history or whatever, or something like that to go with it. Right. And there are a lot of other fantasy books like The Mortal Instruments by Cassandra Clare, the Shannara Chronicles. The Mortal Instruments, it takes place in the real world, but it has that hidden world of fantasy that the normal world doesn't know about. And Harry Potter does the same thing.
Right.
Like, characters in the world of Harry Potter, the Muggles, as they're called, don't know about magic.
Right.
But it's still that real world. Like, you could still go to London or America in the world of Harry Potter, which I don't think readers realize that because they're so wrapped up in the fantasy part. Shannara Chronicles is especially interesting because as you read through it, you kind of find out that yes, it's a fantasy world, but it's a fantasy world born out of the apocalypse of our real world. Like, they'll find ruins of skyscrapers from New York City and stuff, and it's like, oh, whatever happened to make the human race kind of go crazy and be apocalyptic or whatever, it's changed humans. They've kind of branched off into humans and elves and dwarves. That's an interesting idea. But fantasy has so many freedoms and opportunities for readers to play around with, and I think that freedom is what makes them better choices in curriculums in schools. So thank you for joining me here on the UHW podcast. I really appreciate you coming out, talking about these things with me. I hope you had a fun time. I hope you guys had a fun time. I certainly hope this has been an interesting discussion for you guys and for us. Yeah. Thank you all for watching.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.